A black boy was accused of breaking a window at school, but what he said in the principal's office left her frozen. The morning started like any other at Riverside High. Marcus Thompson dragged himself through the crowded hallways, dodging running freshmen and couples making out against lockers. His backpack weighed heavy on his shoulders. AP Chemistry, Advanced Math, and English literature books threatening to break the worn straps. "Yo, Marcus," Devin called out, jogging to catch up with him. "You finished that chemistry homework? Man, I was stuck on those equations all night." Marcus managed a tired smile. "Yeah, it took me forever too. Had to help Lily with her homework first." He didn't mention staying up until 2 a.m. or how his mama had found him asleep at the kitchen table this morning. "How's the little sister doing anyway?" Devin fell into step beside him. "Getting better at math. Still struggling with fractions, though." Marcus adjusted his backpack. "Hey, you bringing your lunch today? I got some extra sandwiches if you want." Devin's face lit up. "For real? Your mama's sandwiches? Man, you know I never say no to those." They rounded the corner to their lockers, where Keisha was already waiting, her braids decorated with bright blue beads that clicked when she turned her head. "Marcus Thompson, where were you yesterday? We needed you for debate club prep." She planted her hands on her hips, but her eyes were smiling. "Sorry, Keisha. Lily had a doctor's appointment, and Mama couldn't leave work." Marcus spun his locker combination, trying to avoid her gaze. He'd been missing a lot of after-school activities lately. "Your mama still doing double shifts?" Devin asked quietly, leaning against the lockers. Marcus nodded, switching out his books. "Yeah. Hospital's understaffed. She says it'll get better next month, but—" He shrugged, letting the sentence hang. The first warning bell rang, sending students scurrying like startled mice. Marcus slammed his locker shut, nearly catching his finger. "See you guys at lunch?" "Same spot," Devin called over his shoulder, already halfway down the hall. First period was English with Mrs. Reynolds. Marcus slid into his usual seat near the window, pulling out his annotated copy of The Great Gatsby. He'd read it twice already, once for class, and once because the story of reinvention and belonging had struck something deep inside him. "Phones away, class," Mrs. Reynolds announced, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. "Today we're discussing the symbolism of color in Chapter 3. Marcus's mind wandered as she spoke. Through the window, he could see the football field where his dad used to coach. Before the cancer, before the hospital bills, before everything changed. "Mr. Thompson?" Mrs. Reynolds' voice snapped him back to attention. "Would you care to share your thoughts on the green light significance?" Marcus straightened in his chair. This, at least, he knew. It represents Gatsby's hopes and dreams. He began, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "But it's also about the gap between what we want and what we can actually reach. How sometimes, no matter how hard we try." The class fell away as he spoke, and for a moment, he was just talking about the book, about dreams and reaching across distances that seemed impossible to cross. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Mrs. Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Very insightful, Marcus. Now, if we look at how this connects to the American dream." By third period, Marcus's stomach was growling. He hadn't eaten breakfast. There hadn't been time between helping Lily get ready for school and catching the early bus. Just 2 more classes until lunch. In AP Chemistry, he paired up with James Willis for their lab work. James was the superintendent's son, but he never acted like it mattered. They'd been lab partners since freshman year, and James was one of the few white kids who didn't treat Marcus differently after his dad died. "Dude," James whispered as they measured out chemicals, "you coming to Sarah's party this weekend? Her parents are out of town, and she's got the whole house to herself." Marcus shook his head, carefully recording their measurements. "Can't. Gotta watch Lily. Plus, you know my mama doesn't like me out late these days." "Come on, man. You never come to anything anymore. We miss you at game nights, too." I know. It's just..." Marcus adjusted their Bunsen burner, watching the flame turn blue. "Things are different now." James opened his mouth to respond, but Mr. Peterson's sharp voice cut through their conversation. "Less chatting, more working, gentlemen." He lingered by their table longer than necessary, his eyes fixed on Marcus. Marcus focused on the experiment, his movements precise and careful. He'd learned early on that he couldn't afford mistakes in Mr. Peterson's class. One wrong move, and… "Thompson!" Mr. Peterson's voice cracked like a whip. "What's the color of that solution supposed to be?" Marcus checked their instructions quickly. "Blue-green, sir." "And what color is yours?" "Blue-green, sir." Mr. Peterson's mouth tightened, but he moved on to the next table. James let out a low whistle. "Man, what's his problem?" Marcus just shook his head. He knew what Mr. Peterson's problem was. It was the same problem some teachers had with Devon, with Keisha, with any kid whose skin looked like theirs. They were always watching, waiting for a mistake. By the time lunch rolled around, Marcus was more than ready for a break. He met up with Devon and Keisha at their usual table near the back of the cafeteria. The sandwich his mama had packed peanut butter and banana, his dad's favorite, tasted like sawdust in his mouth, but he forced himself to eat. "Y'all see the new girl in biology?" Devon asked. Mouth full of Marcus's second sandwich. Fine as hell and smart too. Answered every question Mr. Rodriguez asked. Keisha rolled her eyes. "Yeah, and I am sure you were paying attention to her answers and not just staring at her." "Hey, Marcus," James called out, dropping into an empty seat at their table. "You guys mind if I join? Sarah's being dramatic about something again, and I need a break." The conversation shifted easily, flowing from classes to complaints about teachers to plans for the weekend that Marcus knew he couldn't be part of. He pulled out his phone, checking the time. Lily would be getting out of school in 3 hours. He needed to finish his homework during study hall if he wanted to help her with her math later. That's when he heard it, the first shout, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. The cafeteria fell silent for a split second before erupting into chaos. Marcus turned toward the noise just in time to see Mr. Peterson bursting through the cafeteria doors, his face red with anger. The teacher's eyes swept the room and landed directly on Marcus. Time seemed to slow down. Marcus could see everything with crystal clarity. The jagged hole in the cafeteria window, the rock lying among the shattered glass, the way other students were backing away from him even though he hadn't moved. "Thompson," Mr. Peterson's voice boomed across the suddenly silent cafeteria. "Principal's office, now." Marcus sat frozen, his half-eaten sandwich forgotten on the table. This couldn't be happening. He hadn't done anything. He'd been sitting here the whole time, talking with his friends, planning his sister's math lesson in his head. But he didn't. Devon started to protest. "Now, Thompson." Mr. Peterson cut him off, striding toward their table. Marcus stood up slowly, his legs feeling like lead. He could feel everyone's eyes on him. Hundreds of students, all watching, all judging. Some faces showed shock, others something close to satisfaction, as if they'd been expecting this all along. "Marcus." James's voice was quiet, uncertain. When Marcus looked at his lab partner, James quickly looked away. The walk to Principal Davis's office felt like a death march. Each step echoed in the empty hallway, Mr. Peterson's footsteps hard behind him. Marcus's mind raced. What would his mama say? How would he explain this to Lily? Who would help her with her homework if he got suspended? The secretary looked up as they entered the office, her eyes widening slightly before she smoothed her expression into professional neutrality. "Take a seat," she said, gesturing to the hard plastic chairs against the wall. "Principal Davis will be with you shortly." Marcus sank into the chair, his backpack a dead weight at his feet. Through the office window, he could see students hurrying past, some slowing down to peek inside. News traveled fast at Riverside High. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Devon or Keisha trying to check on him. But he didn't dare take it out, not with Mr. Peterson standing guard like he was some kind of dangerous criminal. The ugly gray carpet beneath his feet began to blur as tears threatened to spill. Marcus blinked hard, forcing them back. He wouldn't cry. He couldn't. His daddy had always said that sometimes the world would try to make him feel small, but he had to stand tall anyway. But sitting there, waiting for Principal Davis to call him in, Marcus had never felt smaller in his life. The secretary's phone buzzed. She listened for a moment, then looked up. "Principal Davis will see you now." Marcus stood on shaky legs, his heart thundering in his chest. He'd been in Principal Davis's office before, to receive awards, to discuss his AP courses, to accept condolences after his father's death. But never like this, never as a perpetrator. As he reached for the door handle, He could feel the weight of expectations and assumptions settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. But underneath the fear and hurt, something else was building, a determination to be heard, to be seen for who he really was. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders just like his daddy had taught him, and opened the door. Inside, Principal Davis sat behind her massive oak desk, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. The desk was covered with papers, probably his records, his grades, all his achievements that suddenly seemed to mean nothing. "Sit down, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice clipped and professional. Gone was the warmth she'd shown just last week when congratulating him on his science fair win. Marcus lowered himself into the chair, acutely aware of Mr. Peterson hovering by the door like a storm cloud. "Would you care to explain what happened in the cafeteria?" Principal Davis asked, folding her hands on the desk. Marcus opened his mouth, but Mr. Peterson cut in. "I saw him, clear as day, Principal Davis." Thompson threw a rock through the cafeteria window, completely unprovoked vandalism. "I didn't," Marcus managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just sitting there, eating lunch with my friend." "Oh?" Mr. Peterson's voice dripped with sarcasm. "And I suppose the window just broke itself?" Principal Davis held up a hand. "Mr. Peterson, please, let him speak." Marcus's phone felt heavy in his pocket. His hands trembled as he remembered Devon's new habit of recording their lunch hangouts for his TikTok channel. Could he have? "Mr. Thompson," Principal Davis's voice cut through his thoughts. "This is a serious accusation. Vandalism of school property could result in suspension, possibly even expulsion." The word expulsion hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "You can check the cameras, ask my friends. I was sitting at my table the whole time. I didn't do anything wrong." Unfortunately, Mr. Peterson interjected. "The security camera in that section of the cafeteria has been down for maintenance this week." Of course it was. Marcus felt the walls closing in. His mama's face flashed through his mind. How tired she looked this morning, kissing him goodbye before heading to another 12-hour shift. What would this do to her? "I've had concerns about Thompson's behavior for some time," Mr. Peterson continued, as if Marcus wasn't even in the room. "The attitude in class, the whispering with other students." "My grades in your class are perfect," Marcus interrupted, anger finally breaking through his fear. "I've never missed an assignment, never failed a test." "Grades aren't everything, young man. Character matters too." The words hit home, exactly as Mr. Peterson had intended. Marcus felt tears threatening again, thinking of all the times his father had said those same words, but with love, with pride, with the belief that Marcus's character was something special. A knock at the door interrupted the tension. The secretary poked her head in. "I am sorry to interrupt, Principal Davis, but here is an urgent call from the superintendent." Marcus noticed something flash across Mr. Peterson's face. Was it worry? But it was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "Thank you, Linda. Mr. Peterson, would you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Marcus alone." Once the door closed, Principal Davis's posture softened slightly. "Marcus," she said, using his first name for the first time since he'd entered her office. "I've known you since you were a freshman. You've been an exemplary student. That's why this is so surprising." Marcus gripped the arms of his chair. "Miss Davis, please, my mama. She works so hard. And Lily, my little sister, she needs me. I wouldn't do something like this. I couldn't." She studied him for a long moment. "Do you have any proof? Anything at all to support your side of the story?" Marcus's hand moved to his pocket, where his phone sat like a lead weight. Devon had been recording, but would the video show anything? And even if it did, would it matter? It was his word against Mr. Peterson's, and he knew how that usually ended. The sound of raised voices came through the door, Mr. Peterson and someone else, arguing in hushed but heated tones. Marcus recognized the second voice but couldn't quite place it. Principal Davis noticed his distraction. "Is there something you want to tell me, Marcus?" He looked at her, really looked at her, trying to see past the principal to the person who'd once told him she was proud of how he'd stepped up after his father's death. Would she believe him? Could she? The voices outside grew louder, then suddenly cut off. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus took a deep breath. Everything, his future, his mama's sacrifices, his promise to take care of Lily, hung in the balance. He reached for his phone, his hand steady now despite the fear churning in his stomach. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "T here is something you need to see." The office felt smaller with each passing minute. The ticking of the large wall clock echoed in Marcus's ears as Principal Davis stared at him from behind her desk. The smell of coffee and old books filled the air, mixing with the lemony scent of cleaning supplies. "I am waiting, Mr. Thompson," Principal Davis said, her fingers drumming on his spotless academic record. 15 years of running Riverside High had taught her patience, but there was a hardness in her eyes now. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. The morning's events played through his mind like a bad movie he couldn't stop. "Principal Davis," he started, his voice barely audible. "I know what it looks like. I know what Mr. Peterson thinks he saw." A knock interrupted him. The secretary poked her head in again. "Ma'am, Mr. Peterson wants to know if you need him back in here." Principal Davis waved her off. "Not yet, Linda." She turned back to Marcus, her expression unreadable. "Continue." Marcus glanced at the photos on her desk, smiling students from years past, their faces frozen in moments of achievement and pride. He used to dream about having his photo up there one day. Now, "My daddy always said," Marcus began, his voice stronger now, "that the truth comes out, even when people don't want to hear it." Principal Davis leaned back in her chair. "And what truth is that, Mr. Thompson?" "The truth about why I am really here." Marcus's hands were trembling, but his voice remained steady. "About why some teachers see me different now that my dad's gone. About why Mr. Peterson's always watching me, waiting for me to mess up." The principal's expression shifted slightly. "That's a serious implication, Marcus." "Yes, ma'am, it is." He reached for his phone with shaking hands. "But I got something to show you, something that might change everything." Principal Davis raised an eyebrow. "Your phone should have been turned off during school hours." "I know, ma'am, and I am sorry about that. But today I am grateful it wasn't." He pulled up his photo gallery, scrolling through recent videos. Devon's face appeared in thumbnails, their daily lunch routine captured in dozens of short clips. "See my friend Devon, he does these TikTok videos every day at lunch. Says he's going to be famous one day." A ghost of a smile crossed Marcus's face. "I always thought it was kind of silly, but now." Principal Davis adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Thompson, if you are suggesting—" "Please," Marcus interrupted, something he'd never done before. Just watch." He found the video from today's lunch period and pressed play. The cafeteria came to life on the small screen. Devon's goofy dance moves, Keisha rolling her eyes, Marcus himself laughing at something James had said. The timestamp in the corner was clear, 12:17 p.m., 3 minutes before the window broke. Principal Davis leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she watched. The video continued, showing their normal lunch routine, Marcus eating his sandwich, Devon trying to steal Keisha's chip, James telling a story about his weekend. Then came the crash. The camera jerked, but for a split second, just a fraction of a moment, it caught something in the background, something Principal Davis had to lean in close to see. Can you play that part again?" she asked, her voice different now. Marcus nodded, rewinding the video. This time, they both watched intently as the scene unfolded again. The crash, the chaos. And in the background, partially obscured but visible enough, James Willis, the superintendent's son, his hand dropping something as he ducked behind the trash can. The silence that followed was deafening. Principal Davis sat back in her chair, her face pale. "Does anyone else know about this video?" "No, ma'am. I didn't even know Devon was recording right then. He does it so much. I just tune it out most days." She stood up abruptly, walking to her window. The afternoon sun cast her shadow long across the floor. "You understand what you are showing me, Marcus? The implication?" "Yes, ma'am." His voice was quiet but firm. "I understand exactly what it means. And T here is more." Principal Davis turned back to face him. "More?" Marcus took a deep breath. This was the moment his father had prepared him for, though neither of them had known it at the time. Remember last semester when Jamal got suspended for cheating on that chemistry test? And Andre the month before that for supposedly stealing from the lab? Those incidents were thoroughly documented, Mr. Thompson. Yes, ma'am, they were. By Mr. Peterson. Marcus pulled up another folder on his phone. But what if I told you I've been keeping my own documentation? He opened a series of screenshots, text messages, social media posts, recorded conversations. A pattern emerging like threads in a tapestry. Jamal was helping James study that day. They were comparing notes when Mr. Peterson walked in, but only Jamal got accused of cheating. Marcus's voice grew stronger. Andre was putting back equipment he borrowed with permission, but Mr. Peterson didn't even let him explain. Principal Davis sank back into her chair. Why? Why didn't they speak up? Would you? Against a teacher's word? Against the superintendent's son? Marcus met her eyes steadily. My daddy taught me to stand up for what's right, but he also taught me to be smart about it, to gather evidence, to wait for the right moment. He looked down at his phone, then back at Principal Davis. I've been watching, ma'am, every time Mr. Peterson accuses someone who looks like me. Every time he lets things slide for someone who doesn't. Every single time. The principal's hand moved to her throat, fingering the pearl necklace she always wore. How long have you been collecting this? Evidence? Since my dad died, Marcus answered softly. He always said that sometimes you have to be your own witness. That the truth needs more than just your word, especially when. He let the sentence hang unfinished. Principal Davis stood again, pacing behind her desk. The weight of what she was seeing, what she had missed, seemed to press down on her shoulders. You could have brought this forward sooner, she said finally. No, ma'am, I couldn't. Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. Not until I had enough. Not until someone had to listen. She stopped pacing, turning to face him fully. And you think that time is now? Yes, ma'am. Because this time, it's not just my word against his. This time, T here is proof that can't be ignored. He gestured to his phone. And this time, it's not just about me. Principal Davis walked to her door, opened it slightly. Linda, please tell Mr. Peterson I'll need a few more minutes with Marcus. Closing the door again, she returned to her desk. Her expression had changed, the stern administrator replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. Show me everything, she said quietly. From the beginning. Marcus nodded, pulling up more files, more evidence. As he began to speak, his voice grew stronger, more confident. This was his moment, not just for himself, but for Jamal, for Andre, for every student who'd ever sat in this office feeling small and powerless. The afternoon sun continued its slow arc across the sky as Marcus shared his carefully collected proof, each piece adding to the picture, each detail filling in the gaps of a story that had been waiting to be told. And in the silence between his words, something shifted in that office. The balance of power, the weight of truth, the courage it takes to stand up not just for yourself, but for others. Principal Davis listened, really listened, for what felt like the first time in years. And as she did, the carefully constructed world of Riverside High began to crack, revealing the truth that had been hiding just beneath the surface. Outside the office, the normal sounds of school life continued. Lockers slamming, students laughing, teachers calling out last-minute homework assignments. But inside, in that moment, everything had changed. Marcus thought about his father, about the lessons he'd taught him, about standing tall when the world tried to make you feel small, about being a witness to truth, even when, especially when, that truth was uncomfortable. The evidence was undeniable, the pattern clear, and as Principal Davis watched the video one more time, her hands clasped tightly on her desk, Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. He thought about James, about the fear in his eyes when the window broke, about Mr. Peterson's smug certainty that his word would be enough, about all the students who had sat in this very chair, unable to defend themselves against accusations that were based on nothing more than the color of their skin. Marcus, Principal Davis said finally, her voice heavy with the weight of revelation, what you've shown me today, it changes everything. He nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. Yes, ma'am. That's why I kept it all. That's why I waited. Because sometimes the truth needs more than just words. Sometimes it needs proof that can't be denied. She reached for her phone, her hand hovering over the keypad. I need to make some calls. This requires immediate action. I understand, Marcus said quietly. But Principal Davis? She looked up, meeting his eyes. When you make those calls, remember Jamal, remember Andre, remember all the others who didn't have proof like this. They deserve to have their stories heard too. Principal Davis's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the phone. Yes, she said softly. Yes, they do. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office floor as she began to dial. Marcus sat quietly, his phone still displaying the evidence that would change everything at Riverside High. In the silence, he could almost hear his father's voice. Stand tall, son. Stand tall and speak your truth. And for the first time since entering that office, Marcus felt truly seen. Principal Davis set down her phone slowly, as if it weighed 100 pounds. Her eyes moved from Marcus to the window, then back again. The silence stretched between them like a rubber band about to snap. Marcus, she finally said, her voice different now, softer, almost uncertain. Before I make these calls, I need to ask you something. He nodded, still clutching his phone like a lifeline. Why didn't you come to me sooner? You've been in my office so many times. Honor roll celebrations, academic awards. Why didn't you ever say anything? Marcus looked down at his hands, thinking carefully before answering. You remember when you gave me that achievement award last year, right after my daddy died? Of course, your mother was here. She was so proud. Yeah, Marcus smiled sadly. She was. And that same day, right after the ceremony, Mr. Peterson stopped me in the hallway, told me not to get too comfortable. Said sometimes people get things they don't really deserve, just because others feel sorry for them. Principal Davis's face flushed. He said that to you? Yes, ma'am. But I couldn't prove it. Just like Jamal couldn't prove he wasn't cheating. Just like Andre couldn't prove he had permission to use that equipment. Marcus's voice grew stronger. It was always our word against his, and our word. They never seemed to be enough. A knock at the door made them both jump. Linda poked her head in again. Ma'am, Mr. Peterson is still waiting outside. He's getting rather insistent. Principal Davis straightened in her chair. Tell. But before she could finish, the door burst open. Mr. Peterson strode in, his face red with anger. This has gone on long enough. We have a clear case of vandalism and… Robert, Principal Davis's voice cut through his words like a knife. You were not invited back in. Sarah, be reasonable. We can't let this kind of behavior. Behavior like what, exactly? She stood up slowly, her hand resting on Marcus's phone. Like falsely accusing students? Like systematic discrimination? Mr. Peterson's face went from red to white in an instant. What are you talking about? Sit down, Robert. It wasn't a request. He remained standing, his eyes darting between Principal Davis and Marcus. Whatever this boy has told you, this boy has shown me evidence, clear, undeniable evidence. She turned the phone toward him. Would you like to explain what we're seeing in this video? Marcus watched as Mr. Peterson's expression changed. Shock, fear, then something darker. You are going to take the word of a student over a teacher? Over 15 years of dedicated service? No, Robert. I am going to take the evidence of my own eyes. The window breaking. James Willis. Your convenient arrival moments later. And this. She swiped to another video. This pattern of behavior that somehow I've been blind to for far too long. Mr. Peterson sank into a chair, his face ashen. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Principal Davis's voice was ice. I understand that I've failed. Failed to see, failed to listen, failed to protect my students. But that ends today. She reached for her phone again. I am calling an emergency board meeting. And Robert, I suggest you call your union representative. The reality of the situation seemed to hit Mr. Peterson all at once. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. This is ridiculous. I won't stand for it. You don't have a choice. Principal Davis's voice was firm. Marcus, would you step outside for a moment? Linda will get you some water. Marcus stood on shaky legs, his heart pounding. As he reached the door, he heard Mr. Peterson's voice, barely a whisper. You'll regret this, Thompson. He turned back, standing straight and tall, just like his daddy taught him. "No, sir. The only thing I regret is not speaking up sooner." The door closed behind him with a soft click. Through the frosted glass, he could see the shadows of Principal Davis and Mr. Peterson, their voices muffled but intent. Linda handed him a paper cup of water, her eyes kind. "You okay, honey?" Marcus nodded, taking a small sip. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his mama, wondering why he wasn't home yet to help Lily with her homework. He thought about texting her, trying to explain what was happening. But how could he put this into words? How could he tell her that everything was about to change? The office door opened again, and Mr. Peterson stormed out, not even glancing in Marcus's direction. Principal Davis appeared in the doorway, her face tired but determined. "Marcus, we're not finished yet. T here is someone else we need to talk to." He knew who she meant. James, the superintendent's son, the boy who had actually broken the window. As he followed her back into the office, Marcus felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a broken window anymore. This was about breaking something much bigger, a system of silence, of looking the other way, of accepting injustice because fighting it seemed too hard. His daddy would be proud, he thought, not just of standing up, but of doing it the right way, with evidence, with dignity, with truth. Principal Davis closed the door behind them, picked up her phone, and began to dial another number. The real battle was just beginning. The afternoon light was fading outside Principal Davis's office window, casting long shadows across her face as she watched the video for what felt like the 100th time. The footage showed Marcus and his friends clearly on one side of the cafeteria, while in the background, the truth unfolded like a silent movie. "Play it again," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Focus on the left corner." Marcus's hands were steady now as he rewound the video. The familiar scene played out. Devon's goofy dance moves, Keisha laughing, Marcus himself taking a bite of his sandwich. Then, in the background, the crucial moment, James Willis, the superintendent's son, in a heated argument with Mr. Peterson. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, "here is something else you should see." He swiped to another video, this one from a week earlier. The quality wasn't as good, but the pattern was clear. Mr. Peterson and James in another argument, their faces tense, voices too low to hear. "How long have you been collecting these?" Principal Davis asked, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Since I noticed the pattern." Marcus pulled up more videos, more screenshots. It wasn't just about me, it was about every student who ever got blamed for something they didn't do. A knock at the door interrupted them. Linda, the secretary, poked her head in. "Ma'am, James Willis is here." Principal Davis straightened in her chair. "Send him in." James entered, his usual confidence nowhere to be seen. His face was pale, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. When he saw Marcus, he quickly looked away. "Sit down, James." Principal Davis gestured to the chair next to Marcus. "We need to talk about what happened in the cafeteria today." I don't know what you mean," James stammered, remaining standing. "Mr. Peterson already said." "Mr. Peterson said a lot of things," Principal Davis cut in. "Now I want to hear the truth." Marcus watched his former friend shift uncomfortably. They'd been close once, lab partners, study buddies, even occasional gaming partners before Marcus's dad got sick. Now, looking at James's face, he barely recognized him. "James," Marcus said softly, "just tell the truth, man. We've got it on video anyway." James's head snapped up. "What video?" Instead of answering, Marcus pressed play. The cafeteria scene unfolded again, but this time, James's face drained of all color as he watched himself in the background. I can explain," he whispered. "Please do," Principal Davis said, her voice firm but not unkind, "and start from the beginning." James sank into the chair, his shoulders slumping. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. Mr. Peterson, he's been helping me." "Helping you how?" Principal Davis leaned forward. "My grades. They're not what they should be. Dad's been pushing for all these AP classes, but I can't keep up. Mr. Peterson said he could help, make things easier." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The chemistry tests, the lab equipment, that was all you. James couldn't meet his eyes. I am sorry, Marcus. I never meant for anyone else to get blamed. But Mr. Peterson said it was the only way, that nobody would question it if the blame fell on certain students. Principal Davis finished, her voice hard. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast orange light across the office walls, making the shadows longer, darker. James, Principal Davis said finally, I need you to write down everything. Every incident, every conversation with Mr. Peterson, everything. My dad, James started. Your father, the superintendent, will be very interested in what you have to say. But right now, I need the truth, all of it. Marcus watched as James pulled out a pen with trembling hands, the same hands that had thrown the rock, that had let others take the blame, that had betrayed years of friendship. Why today? Marcus couldn't help asking. Why did you break the window? James paused in his writing, his pen hovering over the paper. Mr. Peterson, he found out I'd been cheating on his test. Said he'd tell my dad everything unless. He swallowed hard. Unless there was a distraction, something bigger that would take the focus off the great investigation. Principal Davis pressed her lips into a thin line, and naturally he suggested who should take the blame. James nodded miserably. He said no one would question it, that it would be easy to believe. He glanced at Marcus, then quickly away. That it would be easy to believe the black kid did it, Marcus finished, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. The sound of James's pen scratching against paper filled the room as he wrote his statement. Principal Davis watched him carefully, occasionally glancing at Marcus with something like pride in her eye. Here is more, Marcus said suddenly, pulling up another folder on his phone. Other students, other incidents. I've been keeping track. James's pen stopped moving. What do you mean? Show him. Principal Davis nodded. Marcus began pulling up screenshots, text messages, social media posts. A pattern emerged, a clear, undeniable pattern of discrimination and cover-up. Jamal Johnson, accused of cheating last semester? Marcus pulled up a series of texts. He was tutoring you, wasn't he, James? James's face crumpled. I didn't. I never wanted. Andre Williams, suspended for stealing lab equipment? More screenshots appeared. That was your experiment he was helping with. Marcus, please. James's voice cracked. No. Marcus's voice was firm but not cruel. They deserve to have their names cleared. All of them. Principal Davis stood up, walking to her window. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, a beautiful ending to an ugly day. James, she said without turning around, finish your statement. Include everything you've just heard, every incident, every student affected. James bent over the paper again, his handwriting becoming messier as he wrote faster, as if trying to outrun his own shame. Marcus sat quietly, thinking about his father, about the lessons he'd taught him about justice, about standing up for what's right, about how sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. Marcus, Principal Davis turned back to face them. What you've done here, collecting this evidence, staying silent until you had proof, that took incredible courage and foresight. My daddy always said sometimes you have to be your own witness, Marcus replied softly, that the truth needs more than just your word. James looked up from his writing, tears in his eyes. I am so sorry, Marcus, for everything, for letting Mr. Peterson use me, for not standing up sooner, for being a coward? Marcus finished. Yeah, me too. I should have spoken up the first time I saw what was happening. Maybe then Jamal and Andre and all the others. You can't blame yourself for that, Principal Davis interrupted. You did what you had to do to gather evidence, to make sure the truth couldn't be denied. The sound of footsteps in the outer office made them all look up. Through the frosted glass, they could see a tall figure pacing. That'll be my dad, James said, his voice small. Principal Davis, what's going to happen now? She sat back down at her desk, her expression determined. Now, James, we're going to do what should have been done a long time ago. We're going to tell the truth. The door opened without a knock, and Superintendent Willis strode in, his presence filling the small office. His eyes swept the room, landing first on his son, then on Marcus, before finally settling on Principal Davis. Sarah, what's the meaning of this? I was in the middle of a budget meeting when I got your message about an emergency. Principal Davis stood, her posture straight and unyielding. John, please sit down. T, here is something you need to see. The superintendent remained standing, his expensive suit making him look even more imposing. If this is about the broken window, I've already spoken with Robert Peterson. He assures me— Dad, James interrupted, his voice barely a whisper. Please, just watch. Marcus held out his phone. The video queued up once again. The superintendent's expression changed from annoyance to confusion, then to something darker as he watched his son in the background of the footage. What is this? He demanded, but his voice had lost some of its authority. This, Principal Davis said quietly, is the truth we've all been avoiding for far too long. She gestured to James's written statement on her desk. Your son has just provided us with a detailed account of several incidents involving Mr. Peterson, incidents that have affected multiple students unfairly. The superintendent picked up the papers, his hands slightly unsteady. As he read, the color drained from his face. James, he looked at his son. Is this true? All of— James couldn't meet his father's eyes. Yes, sir, Mr. Peterson. He's been helping me cheat, covering up my failing grades. And when he thought he was about to get caught, he suggested creating a distraction, Marcus finished. Something big enough to draw attention away from the grade investigation. Something everyone would believe if the right person got blamed. Understanding dawned on the superintendent's face. He sank into a chair, the papers clutched in his hands. My God. T, here is more, Marcus said, pulling up the folder of evidence he'd collected. Other students who got blamed for things they didn't do, other incidents that got covered up. Principal Davis walked around her desk, standing next to Marcus. The pattern is clear, John, and it stops today. The superintendent looked at his son, then at Marcus, then back at the statement in his hands. James, why? Why didn't you come to me if you were struggling? James's laugh was bitter. Come to you? Dad, you are the one who insisted I take all those AP classes, who said anything less than perfect grades wasn't acceptable, when Mr. Peterson offered to help. Help? His father's voice cracked. This isn't help, James. This is corruption. This is discrimination. This is— He trailed off, looking at Marcus. Young man, I owe you an apology. Marcus shook his head. Not just me, sir. Jamal Johnson, Andre Williams, every student who got blamed because Mr. Peterson knew no one would question it if they looked like me. The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken truths. Sarah, the superintendent finally said, what do you recommend? Principal Davis sat back down at her desk. First, we clear the names of every student affected by this. Then, we conduct a full investigation into Mr. Peterson's conduct. And most importantly, she looked at Marcus, we make sure nothing like this ever happens at Riverside High again. The board will need to be notified, the superintendent said, more to himself than anyone else. Yes, Principal Davis agreed. And John? This can't be swept under the rug. These students deserve justice. The superintendent stood slowly, straightening his tie in what seemed like a reflexive gesture. James, we'll discuss this at home. For now, he turned to Marcus. Young man, I can't begin to express the courage you've shown. Sir, Marcus interrupted gently, I didn't do this for recognition. I did it because it was right. Because my daddy taught me that sometimes you have to stand up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Principal Davis smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Your father would be proud, Marcus, very proud. The sun had almost set completely now, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. Marcus thought about his mama, probably wondering where he was, about Lily, waiting for help with her homework, about his daddy, and what he would say if he could see this moment. The superintendent cleared his throat. Principal Davis, I trust you'll handle the immediate next steps? She nodded. I'll call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. And John, we'll need your full support on this. You have it, he said firmly, then turned to Marcus. And you, young man, thank you for having the courage to expose the truth. As the superintendent left the office, James lingered behind. Marcus, I know I don't deserve it, but can you ever forgive me? Marcus looked at his former friend, seeing not the superintendent's son now, but just a scared kid who'd made some very bad choices. Maybe, he said honestly. But first, you need to make things right, starting with Jamal and Andre. James nodded, wiping his eyes. I will. I promise. Principal Davis stood up. Marcus, let me call your mother. She needs to know what happened today. And, she smiled again, what a remarkable son she has. As she reached for her phone, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The weight of secrets he'd been carrying, the evidence he'd been collecting, the truth he'd been waiting to tell, it all felt lighter now. His daddy had always said that the truth would come out, even when people didn't want to hear it. Today, finally, it had. Chapter 4. Principal Davis sat frozen in her chair, the weight of everything she'd just learned pressing down on her like a physical force. The evidence on Marcus's phone, James's written confession, the years of systematic discrimination she'd somehow missed, it all swirled in her mind like a storm. Linda, she called to her secretary, her voice slightly unsteady. Could you bring us some water, please? Marcus sat quietly, his phone now dark on his lap. The setting sun cast long shadows across the office floor, making the room feel smaller, more intimate. I owe you an apology, Marcus, Principal Davis finally said, breaking the heavy silence. He looked up surprised. Ma'am? As an educator, as a principal, as someone who should have seen what was happening. She shook her head. I failed you. I failed all of you. Linda came in with 2 paper cups of water, her eyes kind as she set them down. Your mother's on line 1, Marcus. She's wondering where you are. Marcus reached for the phone, but Principal Davis held up her hand. Let me speak to her first. She needs to know what happened today, all of it. As she picked up the phone, Marcus could hear his mama's worried voice on the other end. Mrs. Thompson, this is Principal Davis. Yes, Marcus is here with me. No, he's not in trouble. In fact, she glanced at Marcus, her eyes shining. Your son has done something remarkable today. Marcus listened as Principal Davis explained everything. The broken window, the false accusation, the video evidence, the years of documented discrimination. His mama's responses went from worried to angry to proud, her voice carrying clearly across the desk. Yes, Mrs. Thompson, I think it would be very good if you could come down here. No, don't leave work. We can meet first thing tomorrow morning. Yes, the board will be notified immediately. When she hung up, Principal Davis turned back to Marcus. Your mother is very proud of you and very angry about what's been happening. Marcus nodded. She always taught me to stand up for what's right, her and Daddy both. Speaking of standing up, Principal Davis reached for her computer keyboard. There are some emails I need to send right now, board members who need to be notified, parents who need to be contacted. She began typing, her fingers moving quickly across the keys. Jamal Johnson's parents, Andre Williams's family, all the students who were wrongly accused. They all deserve to know the truth. Marcus watched as she worked, thinking about all the lives that would be affected by what had happened today. What's going to happen to Mr. Peterson? Principal Davis paused in her typing. He'll be suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. The board will review all the evidence, including your documentation. And Marcus? She looked at him directly. We'll need you to testify. Yes, ma'am. I am ready. She smiled slightly. I believe you are. You've been ready for a long time, haven't you? Gathering evidence, documenting everything. I had to be sure, Marcus explained. Had to have proof that couldn't be denied. That's what Daddy always said. The truth needs more than just your word sometimes. A knock at the door interrupted them. Linda poked her head in again. Ma'am, the superintendent is back. With Mr. Peterson. Principal Davis straightened in her chair. Send them in. Mr. Peterson entered first, his earlier confidence replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Superintendent Willis followed, his face grim. Sarah, the superintendent began, Robert has something he'd like to say. Mr. Peterson stepped forward, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Marcus's head. I want to confess to my actions, all of them. Principal Davis's voice was cold. All of them, Robert? Are you sure? Because Marcus has quite a comprehensive record. Yes, Mr. Peterson's voice cracked. Everything. The false accusations, the cover-ups, the discrimination. I am prepared to take full responsibility. Marcus watched his former teacher, the man who had made him feel small and powerless for so long, now looking small himself. Why? The question came from Marcus before he could stop himself. Why did you do it? Mr. Peterson finally looked at him, really looked at him. Because it was easy, he admitted quietly. Because no one questioned it. Because I could. The honesty of the answer hung in the air like smoke. That's not good enough, Principal Davis said firmly. Not nearly good enough. No, Mr. Peterson agreed. It's not, but it's the truth. Superintendent Willis stepped forward. We've discussed the next steps. Robert will submit his resignation, effective immediately. He'll cooperate fully with the investigation, including providing written statements about every incident. Principal Davis nodded slowly. And the students? The ones whose records were damaged by false accusations? Their records will be cleared, the superintendent assured her. All of them. And we'll be implementing new policies to prevent anything like this from happening again. Marcus listened to them discuss the details, policy changes, sensitivity training, oversight committees. But his mind was on Jamal, on Andre, on all the others who had sat in this office feeling helpless and alone. What about James? He asked suddenly. The superintendent's face tightened. My son will face consequences for his actions, both at home and at school. He should apologize, Marcus said, to everyone he hurt, everyone he let take the blame. He will, his father promised, starting tomorrow. Principal Davis stood up. Marcus, I think it's time for you to head home. Your mother and sister are waiting. We can continue this tomorrow when she comes in. Marcus gathered his things slowly, his phone feeling lighter now that its burden of evidence had been shared. As he reached the door, Mr. Peterson's voice stopped him. Marcus? He turned back. I am sorry, the teacher said softly, for everything. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. I am not the only one you need to say that to, sir. As he walked through the empty halls of Riverside High, Marcus thought about everything that had happened, the broken window that had started it all, the years of collected evidence finally seeing the light, the truth finally being heard. Outside, the sky had turned deep purple, the first stars beginning to appear. His phone buzzed, a text from Devon asking if he was okay, another from Keisha saying she'd heard what happened. Messages from friends and classmates who had finally seen the truth. Marcus thought about his daddy, about what he would say if he could see this moment, about standing tall when the world tries to make you feel small, about being a witness to truth, even when, especially when, that truth is uncomfortable. As he pushed open the heavy front doors of the school, stepping into the cool evening air, Marcus felt different, stronger, taller. The weight of secrets he'd carried for so long was gone, replaced by something lighter, hope. His mama's car was waiting in the parking lot, Lily waving excitedly from the back seat. Tomorrow would bring meetings, testimonies, changes. But tonight, he was just a big brother with math homework to explain, a son with a story to tell his mama, a boy who had finally found his voice. The truth had come out, just like his daddy said it would, and in the end, it had set everyone free. Chapter 4. Continued. Marcus's mama held him tight in the parking lot, her embrace saying everything words couldn't. Lily bounced around them, full of questions she couldn't quite form. Baby, his mama whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I am so proud of you. So proud. I just did what Daddy would have wanted, Marcus said softly, breathing in the familiar scent of her hospital scrubs mixed with her lavender perfume. He would have been proud, too. You know that, right? She held him at arm's length, studying his face, standing up for what's right, but doing it smart. That's exactly what he taught you. Lily tugged at Marcus's sleeve. Did you really catch a bad teacher, like in the movie? Marcus couldn't help but smile. Something like that, little sister. But right now, don't we have some math homework to tackle? The drive home was quiet, filled with the kind of silence that comes after big moments. Marcus watched the streetlights flash by, thinking about everything that had happened. His phone kept buzzing with messages, but he wasn't ready to look at them yet. At home, while Lily spread her math books across the kitchen table, his mama pulled him aside. Principal Davis told me everything, she said, her voice low, about the evidence you've been collecting. About all those other students who got blamed wrongly. She paused, her eyes glistening. Why didn't you tell me, baby? Marcus leaned against the counter, suddenly feeling very tired. I didn't want you to worry, Mama. You already had so much on your plate with work, and Lily, and you thought you had to handle this all by yourself? She shook her head. Just like your daddy, always trying to carry the whole world on your shoulder. I had to be sure, he explained. Had to have proof that couldn't be denied. And now, he gestured vaguely, now everything's going to change. His mama pulled him into another hug. Yes, it is. And that's because of you, Marcus. Because you were brave enough to speak up, smart enough to gather evidence, and strong enough to wait for the right moment. Marcus, Lily called from the kitchen, I don't understand fractions. He laughed, wiping his eyes. Duty called. As he sat down next to his sister, explaining how to find common denominators, his phone buzzed again. This time, he looked. A message from Jamal. Principal Davis just called my parents. Is it true? Did you really? Another from Andre. Man, I don't even know what to say. Thank you. Just, thank you. And one from James. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I promise I am going to make this right. Lily poked him with her pencil. Are you listening? These fractions are hard. Marcus smiled, putting his phone away. Yeah, little sister, I am listening. Sometimes the hardest things are the most important ones to figure out. Outside their kitchen window, the stars were bright in the dark sky. Somewhere out there, Marcus thought, his daddy was watching, proud of the son who had learned his lessons well, proud of the truth that had finally come to light. Tomorrow would bring changes, meetings with the school board, testimonies to give, stories to tell. But tonight, in this kitchen, with his sister's fractions and his mama's love and his daddy's memory surrounding him, Marcus Thompson was exactly where he needed to be. The truth had come out, just like his daddy always said it would. And in that truth, there was power, there was justice, there was hope. And most importantly, there was tomorrow.